Hi there, and welcome to the introduction. Let's dive right into our first section. What is feedback? Broadly speaking, feedback is a response or a signal that causes you to gain insight or otherwise take a different approach to what you're doing. For example, perhaps during one Christmas morning, you loaded your daughter with so many small gifts under the tree that halfway through opening all of them, you noticed she became extremely bored. She lost the joy and wonder you hoped each gift would bring to her. That's feedback to you. Perhaps next year you'll course correct based on that feedback. Here's another story. See if you can spot all the places where there's feedback. You take the stage at an industry conference. For 3 months, you've been working on your presentation. Early into it, your first joke to break the ice seems to fall flat. As you progress, you notice folks shuffling around in their seats, few yawns. This causes you to speed up your presentation, a move that means you stumble on your words and rush past the most important part. Nobody had questions during the Q&A, and nobody stuck around to talk to you afterward. After it's over, you head straight back to your hotel room. In your gut, you know you underwhelmed a whole bunch of people and did not give your best performance. A week later, results from the conference survey proves your gut to be right. Those who attended your presentation gave you an average score of 2.7 out of 5, and you needed at least a 4.2 for a chance to be invited back next year as a guest speaker. Did you notice all the feedback throughout that story? And did you notice that it was all nonverbal? While we tend to think of feedback as the word somebody says to us, and of course it is, it's also all of these other types of signals that are all around us all throughout the day, from our sense of somebody's boredom to the sense in our own gut. Now, one of the keys to improving in this realm of feedback is refining our ability to discern the truth of the signal from our potentially wrong narratives about it. Us humans, we are meaning-making machines. Sometimes this works in our favor, but many times we weave various pieces of information to create a narrative that simply isn't true. For example, in our story about the speaker, it truly could have been that attendees were rustling and even yawning because they were an international team coming off a long series of flights and still feeling the jet lag of it. And that 2.7 score may have been because when you assumed they were disinterested and adjusted by speeding up your presentation, you blitzed through so fast and stumbled so much that they struggled to stay with you. As we dive into constructive feedback, focusing on the mostly verbal kind we give and receive at work, keeping these stories in mind can help us remember that feedback and opportunities to improve how we work with it are accessible to us in nearly every moment of our lives. Okay, so let's put an official definition of feedback on the table. This is actually kind of a big deal for a few reasons. First, because otherwise we have either the rather clunky dictionary definitions you may find, or the many feedback definitions that aren't about human communications. And unfortunately, many of the articles and books about feedback fail to put forth a definition. And another reason it's important to have a definition is because it becomes a flag in the ground for you and your team. As you all collectively work to improve your feedback capabilities, you may find yourself referencing your shared definition to ensure alignment. So here goes. This is how I define feedback. Feedback is a response to a person's activity with the purpose of helping them adjust to become more effective. Feedback comes in various forms, including evaluative, how you did and where you are, appreciative, how you are valued and recognized, and coaching, how you can improve. Let's unpack this a bit. First, we have here that feedback is a response, meaning there was some stimuli, like a behavior or performance, that the feedback was in response to. When giving feedback, it's important to keep this concept of stimuli and response in mind because doing so will allow you to get beyond making vague feedback statements like "great work" to something more specific and constructive about the behavior or performance, such as, "On our last project, you showed an exceptional mix of team leadership and attention to detail. You kept each team feeling empowered and moving forward while also ensuring we carefully thought through the nuances of every customer touchpoint. Great work." Likewise, as a feedback receiver, keeping stimulus and response in mind can help you ask questions if and when you do receive feedback that is too general for you to make sense of. In responding to that "great work" comment, for example, you might ask something like, "I really appreciate that. And since I'm always looking to reflect on and improve my performance, might you have some specific details in mind about what you think worked particularly well on this one?" We will cover this in more detail in future modules, but keep in mind that effective feedback is always specific feedback. And if you aren't getting it as a receiver, you can improve your chances by specifically asking for specific feedback, including asking for specific positive feedback, as this too is key to your professional development. Next up, Note that this is a response to a person's activity. Remember when I mentioned us humans being meaning-making machines? Well, that function can cause some issues here. Too often we end up creating ineffective and unhealthy feedback experiences because we forget that feedback should focus on a person's activity, not on a constructed story or our judging a person's character based on that activity. You might imagine a colleague showing up late, again, for an important meeting, saying something like, "You have a real problem managing your time. You need to get it together," is a narrative leap. It's assuming you know what's happening in this person's life and you know what their problem is. The tone here isn't so much about the observed activity, but about your judgment of it. Instead, you could say, "Hey, I noticed you were late again to our meeting. Is everything okay?" This approach centers your observation of the activity, steers clear of character judgment, shows concern, and gives the receiver the first move to share what's going on. You may find that, indeed, they do simply struggle to manage their time, or you may find something altogether different, like how they get intense anxiety during important meetings, and this causes them to run late. Or perhaps their child's chemotherapy appointment has recently been running into the time for this meeting. Either way, you will always be in a better position if you focus your feedback directly on what you observed, rather than on a story you've come up with. Next up, we have that the purpose of feedback is to be helpful. It should go without saying, but inherent in this is what feedback is not meant to be. It is not meant to ridicule or belittle. It is not meant to embarrass. It is not meant to harm. Those who have the gift of giving feedback will put themselves in a much better position if they do the inner work of understanding their intentions prior to delivering the feedback. By carving out a quiet moment before giving feedback to ask yourself, why am I giving this? You may uncover some surprising dimensions that show you your intention is not meant to be helpful. I know this because, like you, I am also part of this complex human experience. And we are also part of systems that encourage us to act in certain ways, including ways that may harm others. And for various reasons, we all come at things with different motivations. So I encourage you to check your intention at the door prior to entering into a feedback conversation. Now, there are two more aspects to keep in mind here. The first is that even if you approach feedback with the purest and greatest intention, you can still either give terrible feedback or give feedback terribly. And if the feedback doesn't land well, perhaps for one of those reasons, you should honor that it didn't land well rather than trying to defend yourself by saying, "I didn't mean it like that." In my experience, a far healthier and effective alternative is not to put on the armor of defending yourself, but to take your armor off and walk bravely into, not away from, the conversation. Rather than, "I didn't mean it like that," you might say, "Oh, I can see how what I said could be interpreted that way. That's not quite what I meant. Can I try again?" The second aspect here is that there is a subjective element to what is considered helpful. For example, I once worked in a toxic department where colleagues saw each other more as stepping stones up the hierarchy rather than as teammates. My manager gave me feedback about my need to more aggressively act in that way. To him, his intention was to be helpful, and indeed, had I adopted his feedback, it probably would have helped me climb the ladder in this horrible environment. But to me, the feedback was not helpful. I didn't want help navigating this environment. In fact, I was actually plotting how to get out. So helpful feedback during that quarterly performance review would have been perhaps advice on how to pursue stretch assignments in different departments, or specific advice on how I could improve the numbers I was driving. As you are likely seeing at this point, feedback can be challenging because human communication can be challenging. And we often exacerbate these feedback challenges when we split feedback into camps, as though one side is purely the givers and one side is purely the receivers, with little overlap between. This can result in, for example, not managers and direct reports building strong relationships so they understand what each other may want and need, and from that place forming an effective feedback relationship, but rather the manager taking a wild guess on what kind of feedback is helpful. Helpful, constructive feedback fills gaps in understanding. It can highlight strengths we didn't know were strengths and do the same with weaknesses, and then point the way to how we can maximize those strengths and shore up those weaknesses. In my current role, my manager and I have empowering and honest one-to-one conversations several times each month, and I try to have the same for those who report to me. As such, my manager has a great sense for what kind of feedback is most helpful. Now that we've covered intention, let's get to the outcome. The outcome of feedback is ultimately to help someone adjust to become more effective. While it can be alluring to jump right to more effective, perhaps the most important point here is adjust. Feedback was never about purely pointing out a past behavior. As you see in our feedback definition, Feedback isn't just about responding to the stimulus. It's about responding to the stimulus and helping someone adjust, which means adjust their future performance, because what else can we adjust? Some think feedback is only about pointing to the past and basically stopping there. This is why many folks feel the need to say feed forward rather than feedback, or even put the word constructive in front of feedback as if to make 100% sure we're talking about helpful feedback. And then there are those who take a contrarian stance of saying feedback doesn't work. Team, feedback works. It's literally all around us all the time. It's how we've improved in anything ever. Feedback is actually why we've been able to make it through this world and remain alive. We engage in some behavior. If it's dangerous or harmful, it often hurts, which is feedback about it. And we use that feedback to adjust our behavior in the future by not touching the hot stove or whatever. This is how feedback works. Now, yes, human-human feedback communications doesn't always work. But that's not because there's something wrong with the nature of feedback or even the word feedback. It's because, frankly, human-human communication doesn't always work, as you may have noticed in your life. It's very difficult. It takes work. And by engaging in this course, you are putting in the reps right now. And as I think you'll see once you bring what you've learned in this course into your work, these reps will help both yourself and those around you. Lastly, to put a bow on this section, yes, it's not about adjusting for adjusting's sake. It's about adjusting to become more effective, which again means more effective in some future performance or behavior. And lastly, let's spend some time on the 3 common feedback forms here. There are many forms of feedback, but I found these 3 types to be especially helpful in allowing us to easily categorize the most common types. These come from a fantastic book titled Thanks for the Feedback, The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well. In my opinion, this is the #1 book about feedback you should have on your shelf if you care about this topic. I'll link to it in the description. Okay, so you can think of evaluative as like the audience survey we mentioned earlier. This survey let the speaker know how she scored out of a possible 5 points. In this sense, it let her know how she did and where she stands on the scale. Evaluative feedback might also come from a colleague who provides feedback, positive or negative, about how you did on a particular task compared to how they think it could have gone. Appreciative, as you can guess, is the kind of feedback that makes you feel seen and valued. The coaching feedback type specifically calls out how you might be able to improve. With positive feedback, coaching feedback might be specific and actionable steps you can take to double down on your strengths. With negative feedback, the coaching feedback type would provide specific and action-oriented tips for how to improve what the feedback giver perceives as your areas for improvement. Keep in mind here that while these 3 types can be a helpful tool for framing the many types of feedback, feedback can cut across all of them. For example, consider this feedback and see if you can find the 3 types within it. You performed exceptionally well this quarter, beating your forecasted quota and making it into the top 1% of sales in your region. Well, that first part could be seen as appreciative. On the whole, I'd say it falls into evaluative, especially because it provides the comparison points against the forecast and against the regional sales numbers. And the way you did it, with a passion for our customers and a deep sense of humility, is something myself and our leadership team greatly admires. This one is clearly appreciation. In fact, the giver is even going beyond their own appreciation to relay appreciation from the leadership team. Throughout the quarter, I've noticed you can be a riveting public speaker, particularly when you set your notes aside and speak from the heart. In my experience, building on this strength can open new doors. And if it's an area you'd like to improve in, I just finished working with a coach to improve my own skills in this regard, and I'd be happy to make the introduction. Our department can fund the expense from our professional development budget. Even if we took the word coach out of this one, this would be an example of coaching feedback. The feedback giver here highlights an area for improvement and pulls both from what they observed, the strength of speaking from the heart, and their own experience in going through some training to offer a way forward on how to improve. To solidify our understanding of each feedback type, here are 5 examples for each. Evaluative feedback example number 1. At the end of the quarter, you drove 10% fewer marketing leads than you forecasted. Notice here it's evaluative because it's comparing the number of leads to a forecasted number. Number 2, the direct report tells you, you are the best leader I've ever worked with. Again, while this can also be appreciative, we could consider this evaluative because there's an element of comparison. Number 3, you did not meet the qualifying standards to participate in the Boston Marathon. Number 4, you moved to number 4 on a Duolingo leaderboard. Notice here the mix of verbal and nonverbal types. Climbing the rankings on a leaderboard is feedback about how you're doing against others. And number 5, your manager says you are in the top 5% of all performers. Moving on to appreciative feedback, example 1. Your basketball team center points to you in gratitude after that great pass. Number 2, a colleague recognizes you in a Slack channel for going above and beyond. Number 3, your teacher praises you in class for always asking great questions. Number 4, upon returning from a dangerous military mission, one sergeant hugs another. And number 5, a patron at the restaurant where you work leaves you a great tip. Notice the importance here of appreciation. It not only feels good and can increase morale, but it also reinforces that you are doing something well, which is an important part of positive feedback, of understanding our strengths and improvements. Moving to coaching feedback, example number 1. Here's what worked for me when I was in a similar position, a colleague begins. Number 2, your ballet teacher offers advice on how to improve your grand plie. Number 3, the last 2 projects you managed went over budget. It wasn't by much, but here are some principles I always put in place to ensure this doesn't happen. Number 4, through active listening and asking great questions, one teammate guides another to finding their own solution to a challenge. Notice here that peers can serve as coaches for each other. The coaching feedback type doesn't always necessarily need to come from someone more skilled or experienced. And number 5, it's clear you have a good sense of your weaknesses, but I wonder if you have a similar sense of your strengths. Are you open to exploring how we can bring those to this situation? Notice also how the coaching feedback type can vary, ranging from very specific to conversational guidance that in some way helps the feedback recipient see new perspectives or make better decisions. To wrap up our feedback definition section, I'd like to define one more term for you. It's one we'll mention several times throughout the course and explore in greater detail in a future module. Feedback literacy. Ultimately, what we're trying to do in this course is improve our overall feedback literacy. Feedback literacy is a term I use to refer to an individual's understanding of and capacity to effectively give, receive, process, ask for, and use feedback. The term has research roots in the world of education, where it is primarily used to describe students' ability to receive feedback. I've expanded its use, pulling it into the business world, so we have a broad term to describe overall feedback capacities. Okay, let's move on to the next step.